Now, the question number 1 would be, if I were to simply write that all staffs, contractors and vendors working on site must undergo training. Yes. So now, if my sentence says this, that all staffs, contractors and vendors working on site must undergo training. Now, if this sentence is given to you, how are you going to read this particular sentence? Now, there are two ways of interpretation that is possible. One way of interpretation is that all the staffs, all the contractors, and only those vendors who are working on site must undergo training, or only those staffs, contractors and vendors who are working on site must undergo training. Or I'll give one more simple example, then I'll come back to this. But this question let us keep. Now, if I were to say that all boys and girls with long hair must go to principal's cabin. Now, how do we read this? Are we going to read it as all boys, whether they have long hair or short hair, and only girls with long hair must go to principal's cabin? So, two interpretation: all boys plus girls only with long hair, or boys and girls with the long hair. So, this long hair, does it apply to only girls, or whether it applies to both boys and girls? I want discussion to happen. Yes.
For both.
Both. Yes. So, Arvindji is told both. It applies to this, that is this one, no sir, that is boys with long hair and girls with long hair should go to principal's cabin.
Correct.
Yes. Anybody else with the other thought process?
किसी को कोई जवाब देना है कि मुझे भी लगता है
अरविंद सर जो बोल रहे हैं वही है,
वही
बोल रहे हैं.
हाँ.
Okay. So there is a rule of interpretation, something called as rule of last antecedent. Rule of last antecedent basically means that whenever there is a particular qualifier का मतलब a example में long hair was a qualifier. Now this qualifier only applies to the last term that was used. So if I am simply using the word that all boys and girls with long hair, now if I were to say that the term long hair is a qualifier, that qualifier is only applicable to the immediately previous term, that is only it is applicable to girls only. So the interpretation of rule of last antecedent, if we apply, and that is to be applied whenever the court reads the law, it applies RLA, then it says all boys. So this means with or without hair, without long hair, and only those girls with long hair must go to the principal. So this is how we are supposed to. Now similarly, if I come back here, when I say all staffs, contractors and vendors working on site. So here working on site is a qualifier. So this working on site is not applicable to staff or contractors. It is only applicable to vendors. So all staffs must go to training, all contractors must go to training, and only those vendors who are working on site must go to training. So if I am a vendor who is not working on site, I need not go. But if I am a staff who is not working on site, I still have to go, because rule of last antecedent is only applicable to vendors and not to staffs and contractors. Very clear on this?
Tell me one thing, can you give any GST example on this?
Yes. I will come back to that, sir.
Okay.
Yes. So now comes the question as to, when we're reading this, where is that, how it is applicable to that of a GST law. Now I will just show the section, so whether the Word document is visible, sir.
Yes.
Now, only for the purpose of example, now let us understand section 74. Now 74 talks about, if we want to call something coming under section 74, the special ingredients must be attracted. What are those special ingredients? That is,
fraud.
It must be either a fraud or willful misstatement or suppression of facts to evade payment of tax. Now comes the question, how do I read? Because it says fraud, yes, or willful misstatement, or suppression of facts to evade tax. Now comes the question. Now comes the question. अगर मैंने fraud किया है, तो that itself is with an intention. There cannot be a fraud without intention to evade payment of tax. So that is a separate class altogether. But then comes the question, willful misstatement. Now when I make a willful misstatement, is that willful misstatement should be with an intention to evade tax, or whether any willful misstatement is covered under 74.
Any willful misstatement. Because the word is itself willful, na? Therefore, the intent to evade tax is already there in willful misstatement.
Now, willful, the question is what is will? Now, in willful, will is not evade the tax. Will is basically the person is aware that कि वो झूठ बोल रहा है. So the idea when we differentiate, there are three ingredients. But what is the classic difference between fraud, willful misstatement, and suppression? In fraud, there is a device that is used. Whenever we say device, we are not talking about a phone or something else. Device का मतलब I am actively doing something to defraud the government. For example, I am doing a invoice, और then मैं वो invoice को फाड़ के फेंक रहा हूँ, और I am replacing one invoice with another invoice. So there is active involvement in doing something. There is a paper that I am creating. That becomes fraud. Whereas willful misstatement basically means, the difference between willful misstatement and suppression is keeping quiet, whereas willful misstatement is a lie. At best it is a lie. So lie becomes a lie when I know that it is a lie. So willful misstatement means it is a misstatement that I have told something wrong. Sometimes I often get WhatsApp messages where they say that UNESCO has declared Indian national anthem as the best national anthem in the world. Now, if I just forward it to somebody else, it is a misstatement because I am making something which is not true. But when I forward it, most of the times I receive it in a family group, the people who are forwarding it don't know. So it is mere misstatement, not willful mistake. However, if where I know that this particular commodity should attract higher rate of tax, or when I particularly know whatever I am supplying is a different item altogether, and there I willfully misstate it, then it becomes wrong. But now the question is not that. The question is whether any willful misstatement will attract 74, or only those willful misstatement that is used to evade payment of tax. Because evade tax is a qualifier. Now, evade tax, if it is a qualifier, is it only applicable to suppression of facts, or is it also applicable to willful misstatement?
Anwesh, the example which you have given,
Yes.
come to that example, that is staff, vendors.
Yes, I will do that.
Show me that example again.
Now,
Anwesh, show me that example.
yes, one
again.
second.
Okay.
Because I'm dealing in. Yes.
Yes. Now, if you see all staffs, after staff you have put the comma?
Yes.
Okay. After staff, this is comma. Therefore, all staff must undergo training. Contractors and vendors working on site must. Suppose there is no comma after staff, then what will be the interpretation?
Yes. I'll come to that, sir. I'll come to that.
Similarly, here also, all boys and girls, there is no
Commas.
There is no comma. Therefore, the interpretation will be both boys and girls having long hair should. And go for 74. Again, after fraud, there is comma.
Yes. Correct. You're coming there, sir. So here in 74, they are creating classes. Now, they say the word fraud. Right after the word fraud, they have put one comma. That means the fraud itself is one class.
Correct.
So whether there is evasion or no evasion, it makes no difference. This is one class.
Correct.
Then it is followed with fraud, comma, willful misstatement, or. Now, between willful misstatement and or, there is no comma.
Correct.
So, willful misstatement or suppression of facts to evade tax. Yes. So, because there is only one comma, that is fraud. Ideally, when we say rule of last antecedent, when we apply, the general rule would be saying that if evade tax is a qualifier, it should only apply to suppression of facts. That is a general rule. But because there is no comma that is put after willful misstatement, this whatever I am putting in yellow, no, yellow is not visible, I put it in blue. Now, this blue color, whatever I have marked, that is comma, that comma is not there. If that comma was there, then evade tax is only applicable to suppression of facts.
Correct.
But because that is not there, this becomes a separate class. This becomes a second class, that is willful misstatement and suppression of facts. This is the second class. So that qualifier must apply to both. So department cannot only say you have willfully misstated. they should also prove that you have misstated, because of which there is tax evasion. So that is how it works. Now, how does that comma also functions? So there is something called as in taxing statutes, there is something called as Oxford comma.
अच्छा, ये क्या है?
Now, Oxford comma is not something, it is found by grammar Nazis. वो बोलते हैं कि ये grammatically ठीक नहीं बैठता है. You are not supposed to put it this way. But for a taxing statute, for them to make it understandable, they use this Oxford comma. For example, if I were to say, property must be divided between A, comma, B and C. Now the question is, if there is one property, are you going to divide it into two parts? And you will say, this will go to A and this will be going to B and C. Or are you going to read it as, we are going to divide the property into three parts and say A, B and C? How are we going to read this?
Second, 1/3 each.
1/3 each. Okay. Yes. Anybody else?
चाहिए?
Equally.
सबके बीच equally.
Yeah.
One and B and C, two part.
Two parts. Yes. So this is how the interpretation becomes interesting, because it's the same sentence and one is reading in one way, another is reading another way. So that is where they use this Oxford comma, because if our intention was to say that let us divide the property into three pieces, then we have to create three classes. But just by putting one comma, we are only creating two classes, because and is not creating a separate class. It is reading B and C as one class. So this is where we use after B. If we put one comma, A, comma, B, comma, and C, grammatically this is not correct, because they will say that the moment you say and, you can't put comma and then say and again. But this is statutorily, they say this is for Oxford comma. That means the only when they put B, comma, and C, then we have to think it is three parts. If there is no comma after B, there is no comma between and, then it is only for two parts.
Any example in GST?
I will take you through the examples, sir. I'll come back to that probably at the end. Okay, on Oxford commas. That is also the one what we were talking about. This is also a classic example of absence of Oxford comma.
अच्छा.
तो क्योंकि willful misstatement, अगर उन लोगों को तीन क्लास बनाना था, then they ought to have written fraud, willful misstatement, and one comma they were supposed to put. Then or suppression of acts to evade tax. Because they have not put that comma after willful misstatement or suppression becomes the same class.
Correct.
So or and does not actually subdivide. It actually groups words into one different class altogether. And anybody till now what we have discussed, any questions?
किसी को कुछ कहना है? Okay. Yes, Anwesh, carry on.
Yes. Now that we have understood rule of last antecedent, now also that we have understood Oxford comma क्या होता है और उसे कैसे पढ़ते हैं, let us go into the next one. That is, now why are we actually reading this? Now this is because this is something called as grammatical interpretation. We use the rule of the grammar. We use certain punctuations to understand, to derive the meaning of what that sentence is. So ideally, grammatical interpretation is a part of literal interpretation. Now, literally, जो लिखा क्या गया है, उसको हम पढ़ेंगे, and we will try to arrive a meaning out of this. That is literal interpretation. Now, till very recent past, I, as a student of law, I would understand that literal interpretation and strict interpretation were both one and the same. That is what I used to understand. But now, in the Raju Bansil case, Supreme Court categorically on record have differentiated that literal interpretation is different from that of a strict interpretation. Now, in today's session, we will be talking about what are those differences and how the judgment is going to impact our GST reading in upcoming future. So, if I were to just take you through para 33 of the judgment, I will go very slow because our attempt is not to just finish off the judgment, but to take one or two essence from the whole of the judgment. So